I now call this House to order and welcome everybody to the semi-final of McGoun 2013. I welcome the Prime Minister to defend the case that stands in his name. Will you be doing 7 minutes or 6 minutes?
7.
Opposition, will you be splitting?
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, Andrew and I have a very important issue that we want to bring to you today. This House would legalize the trade of ivory obtained from endangered species. I want to talk to you a little bit about the way that the model works. First of all, the international treaty which governs the trade of animals and animal parts is called CITES, okay? Generally speaking, the participants in that treaty include almost every country in the world, with just a couple of exceptions. Under that treaty, species are categorized as at risk or in danger. Their level of risk is then assessed, and then they create guidelines to address that. So for very endangered species, it means no trade at all. For other ones, you might allow the trade of wild animals, say, to zoos, but not allow, the trade in parts. So under that agreement, we're saying that we should sort of make an exception to the way that the rule works. And the reason for that is this. In 2004, the Conference of the Parties got together and decided that when they make decisions about whether to declare a species endangered and how to restrict trade, that they should consider the terrible economic impact that some of these listing decisions have on small, isolated rural communities who depend on the sale of those animals and those parts for their livelihoods. But to date, they've done absolutely nothing about it. So Andrew and I see our policy today as a response to that decision and a very specific example of that principle in action. So, we would maintain the at-risk designation. We would acknowledge that the species is endangered, but we would not restrict the trade, except insofar as to introduce a regulated market to verify where the ivory is from and to catalog to make sure that it's not being obtained without licensing, the same way that's done for hunting a non-endangered species, okay? We think that that monitoring is still effective and important, even if we're not preventing the trade altogether. We would leave all other protections related to the protection of their natural environments and all of those things in place. Everybody understand? Excellent. I'm going to be bringing 2 arguments in my first constructive speech. First, I want to talk about the paramountcy of the economic benefits of the wildlife trade. So first of all, it's important to understand that ivory is the most valuable commodity in the world in terms of its volume of trade, okay? So just a bit of background information. Before the listing of cockatoo species in Africa in the 1990s, a single pair of individuals could make $325 a day trading those animals once captured. That's compared to the $250 per year average for a family income. Okay? So that's the kind of scale of economic opportunity that we are talking about denying to these communities. Now, obviously that money is important in and of itself, but I want to point out a couple very specific economic advantages that we see emerging from this trade. First of all, most endangered species exist in underdeveloped countries, and most of the demand exists in developed countries. That means that international trade comprises almost the entire market for these products. Okay, so even though domestic trade can't be messed with under the international agreements, that really doesn't occur anyway. So this is their only opportunity to sell. They have one market to sell to, and that's in the developed world. Okay, the government can effectively tax all of the trade that goes on, right? But if none of the trade happens, then the government also doesn't get money from that. We would make this akin to what happens, I'll take you in just a second, Trevor, if you were to say, we're not going to allow you to trade any of your mining products because there might be some negative sociological impacts. As resource-based economies, they would have no economic growth whatsoever. Sure.
So these are animals, by their nature, are endangered. So they are going to go extinct, especially if we speed this up. Okay. So this is going to create an unsustainable
Andrew's going
market.
to take a lot of time to explain why market pressures create the best ecological incentives, so I'll leave that to him and let you make your argument for why you think this is going to hurt the species first. Okay, so the governments of a lot of African countries currently possess large stockpiles of products that they're not allowed to sell. Ivory collected from elephants that say died of natural causes. Okay, this is an enormous capital injection for these countries. If you were to allow this international trade, they would immediately be able to get billions of dollars for their incredibly impoverished countries immediately. And we think that that capital injection can be reinvested to support any type of local economy whatsoever, right? Any type of forward-moving development. It is free capital. And we think that that is something which is incredibly rare in the developing world, because almost always the money that they have is tied to the will of some foreign corporate power. Not so in this case. They have a monopoly on these resources and can use that to advance their country economically. We think that's very important. Trade also encourages businesses to invest locally in the economy because they want to trade with people who have a basic level of health and education to make that trade stable. So we think you do create good incentive structures for that trade. Current sanctions hurt the national government because the national governments are held accountable under international treaties, but poachers always get off. When you have a regulatory system, it's domestic punishments, and you catch the people you actually want to catch. So, those are some of the economic advantages that we see coming from this trade. Now I want to talk very briefly about the political and sociological benefits of wildlife trade. International trade in wildlife is the third highest illegal black market. That is behind drugs and human trafficking, but ahead of weapons, okay? $500 billion a year, or somewhere in that ballpark, okay? Almost all of that money is going to professional, organized, criminal organizations in the third world. What do they do with that money? They use that funding to reinforce their control over a subjugated rural population who has no government to defend them. They use that money to buy guns to control that population and cement their power structure. The poorest rural communities are forced into supporting that organization, sometimes by hunting the animals themselves, so that the poachers don't even need to do any work to make all of that money. We think that is abhorrent. We think that this will abolish the black market as it exists right now, both because the government stockpiles will cause the price to plummet, reducing the incentive to poach, because a regulatory system makes it harder to poach, because there's an economic incentive for people to defend something that they can make money off of, so they will not want to poach, and they will have a reason to try to stop people poaching these animals, which are otherwise useless to them, right? We think that we saw a terrific example of this when the trade in the endangered American crocodile leather was legalized in the United States. Their numbers bounced back because we provided economic incentives to protect those animals. We think that that's exactly what would happen here. So for all of those reasons, we're very proud to propose this motion.
Hear, hear. I thank the member for his speech and welcome the Leader of the Opposition to open up a constructive stance from side opposition in a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
All right, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to sort of leave my representation there constructive. We bring you 3 points today. The first one's going to be talking about conservation. As much as he can promise that there are going to be market forces that correct for these problems, we don't actually buy that. Right? Trevor tells you in POI, like, by nature, these are endangered species, right? And when you look at how endangered species populate, right, you need a critical breeding population, and you need that population to be concentrated in a certain area in order for it to actually be viable in the future, to prevent inbreeding from happening, to prevent the deterioration of the gene pool, right? The fact that these animals exist in herds, like elephants, right, which means that, and they apparently live in these, like, these elephants are in the same area, these, like, poor rural villages, right, means that you have a very large and vulnerable population that is close by these villages that are desperate for money, right? If we have to swallow the harm that, like, poaching and, like, the ivory trade is very, very lucrative, and that these communities are desperate, so do they, right? They can tell you all they want about market forces and how you're not going to be poaching. But if they are telling us that these animals exist in very small, rural, poor communities, it doesn't matter what that market price is going to be as long as they can get some money for it, right? We tell you that, like, moreover, you're actually endangering the species in the long run, right? Not only is this not a sustainable economic development model, right? But you're actually endangering these species in the long run, right? You're not, like, currently, we take animals, the only reason we take animals out of the wild, like beyond illegal poaching, is to give them to zoos, right? To increase the captive breeding population. While the breeding rate in zoos are much, much lower in the wild, we think that's the only chance, for, the only the only chance for us to be able to continue the survival of these species is to put them either in zoos or on conservation reserves, right? Where we're not allowed to touch them, and we guard them, right, to make sure that there are no poachers, right? We would rather continue establishing these models, sure.
Hey, dairy farmers don't kill all of their cows because they know they need those cows. Why are these people going to kill all the animals that provide them with their income?
I am a poor, starving villager. There is an animal out there that can get me food tomorrow morning. I don't care in the long, if I can't eat, if they're telling you that the market price is going to be depressed because the government is flooding the market with money, and these rural villagers really have no alternative to get money, which is what they want, which is what they've told you. They want to be giving these rural villagers an income source, right? If the market price is depressed, then I'm going to have to kill lots and lots of elephants in order to make my living, right? And not only that, if we are really, really that desperate and the market price is going to be diminished, then I'm poor and starving and desperate, then we say in that instance that short-term needs always always take it over long-term interests, right? We say that you can't actually measure things, you can't actually perceive the effects of declining gene pools, for instance, right? Until many, many generations later, and not all poor villages necessarily know about breeding, about conservation, right? Or necessarily know about deterioration of gene pools. And moreover, they're not actually conservationists, right? They don't actually know how many African elephants are left out in the wild, right? There are all these factors that prevent villages the market from being able to adequately safeguard against the fear of deterioration of these very vulnerable animal populations, right? We say to you that we think that there are better ways to do this, right? We think that there is a growing market for ecotourism, right? And that's showing to be very promising for some villages, right? We would rather not have the risk of we would rather not have the risk of declining populations by placing these elephants on reserves and having safari tours, right? Or at least these elephants are preserved, right? Maybe it's not lucrative right now. Maybe it's less lucrative right now, but we think that if the government invests in this and starts promoting this, actively promoting this, we think that we can offer them an alternative and more sustainable economic outcome in the future, right? Because tourism, recognize that tourism eventually brings in more money, right? And more money to stimulate the economy, which means that there's more money to flow around, which means they can develop cottage industries and have some sort of base to go on, right? We say that this is the better model. We'd rather stick them on the reserves right now, right? But the third thing I want to be talking to you about is that Dylan gives you this argument about criminal organizations, right? But he tells you, and he tries to paint them out as sort of separate from the government. Our third constructive point is about how governments and markets and criminal organizations don't actually fund, we don't actually trust governments to be able to effectively regulate this trade either, right? And because we think that those same criminal elements that currently poach elephants are actually also embedded in the government to some extent, right? So we doubt the ability, when Dylan says this is free capital, right, that can be used for development, we say that the same problem that exists in African nations, in terms of the resource curse, for instance, also applies to massive influxes of capital from the sale of this ivory trade, right? He tells you that it's going to necessarily result in development. We say, Mr. Speaker, that's not true. We say that in countries like Nigeria, where you've had massive bonanza, oil wealth, for instance, that the money doesn't actually get reinvested into helping the economy, right? Because you do have corruption in these governments, because you do have criminal organizations embedded in these very governments as well, right? Because we see that sometimes those governments, I'll take you in a second, aren't the best stewards of these resources. Sure, Dylan.
Catherine, just because some of the funds will be wasted, surely you're not arguing that the best way is to starve them out by making sure the governments and the people never get any money so they don't misspend it.
Okay, so we think what we can do is first of all, we think it is very, very dangerous to be even introducing this possibility, right? That we will start buying ivory from any nation, right? Regardless of what kind of responsible practices that they implement, right? But second of all, our response is that we think that we can do things better, right? So the Amazon rainforest, for instance, we pay the Brazilian government and the Peruvian government to conserve their rainforest, right? We can do that on our level as well. We can help stimulate this ecotourism and stimulate reserves for elephants as well, right? If you really, really want to be doing that, we think we can mitigate those harms. We think we can also, if you're talking about international development, if you're talking about development, for instance, we say that it's better to actually go through traditional models of development that don't involve selling off all your resources, right? We would rather if you really want to be helping these countries develop, maybe we start giving them loans or whatever, right? Or things that are more directed, things that we know can concretely benefit the people and don't come at the expense of the wildlife that occurs there, right? Mr. Speaker, we really hope they give you some sort of answer to this conservation point. We are proud to oppose.
Hear, hear. I thank the member for her speech and welcome the MC to continue his constructive case in the speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, they said deal with conservation, so I might as well start off with that. So we think that after what we're going to show you basically is that not only do we conserve these species, but we actually increase the probability of that species thriving and being removed from the at-risk population. So what we want to first look at is what happens when you now have a species that is valuable to you and that you can make money off of. And the point that I brought up in my POI is the fact that we don't kill off animals that are beneficial to us, that we maintain them because they're a source of income. A dairy farmer is never going to one day kill all of his dairy cows so that he can sell them for a one-time lump sum of steak instead of maintaining that population and maintaining a long livelihood that he can continue to make money off for generations and generations. We think that okay, granted there might be a small influx of people killing off these animals initially, but we think that people aren't incredibly dumb, they are going to think long term. We think you might have a small dip in the population, but after that people are actually going to understand that conserving that species is tied to their income and therefore incentivize them to do so.
Conserving elephants is a group good, right? Hunting the elephants while everyone else conserves them is an individual good. How do you correct for that?
We think that no, not hunting them and conserving them is an individual good, because you maintain your income. When your village, which understand is far more collective and different from a westernized city and is far more community based, understands that this field of animals in front of them is their only source of income and is their main source of income, they're going to conserve them. We think that an individual also understands that if he goes out and kills all of them and destroys his hunting grounds, that after a year's time he's no longer going to be able to provide for his family. We think that people do understand some long-term goals. We think that's quite obvious. Furthermore, we have examples of this. We can look at campfires in Zimbabwe, where basically what they did was kind of put this into place. They allowed a community to look after the local habitat. And they did look after that local habitat because it provided them with profit, provided them with livelihood. Basically, you have as I've said over and over again, you have an incentive to maintain that population because that population is your income. We think that when you're directly tied to that income, there's obviously an incentive to keep that around. We think that that's why we actually conserve the population. Furthermore, what I want to look at is how current forces actually target against the population that currently exists. So understand that just because it's an endangered species and it's in front of your village, because you can't capitalize any money on it, it is not valuable into any way, shape, or form. So what actually happens is that you destroy that ecosystem, you destroy that animal, so you can put in place something that does make money. And what that is agriculture. So what happens is that you now have this endangered species that's actively hunted against because it destroys crops so that you can plant agriculture. So understand this. There's an incentive to keep the population alive with Dylan and I's model. There's an incentive to destroy that population when we leave it at the status quo because that animal is a harm to your agricultural practices, which is your only source of income currently. But the reason that this agriculture incentive is destroyed in our model is because obviously this makes more money, so you're going to forego agriculture in favor of this ivory trade instead. And so also we see that it's important to note here that CITES has no legal recourse on an individual basis, so this country can destroy this natural population, and CITES has no impact on it, so that's why the fact that villages can destroy local endangered populations, and there's no recourse, and that's why it happens for these agricultural purposes in the first place. So we think that overall what we've largely shown you here and what I've just shown you is that conservation is best incentivized through our model, and furthermore the act of anti-conservation or destruction of these local populations is mitigated by Dylan and I's model. So now what I want to go into is a little bit of clash. So the first thing that they talk about is this whole idea of like ecotourism. We think this is pretty easy to deal with. If you look at things like ecotourism, we see that like 70% of ecotourism shows like massive economic losses. We think it's just like simply not a sustainable thing that exists in the first place. Furthermore, we point to that like if ecotourism like is a lucrative, financially viable organization, we say like why doesn't it exist? Like why are countries not massively capitalizing on their ecotourism, and why is it not like something that they're like hugely promoting? We think that the reason is because like the market force simply doesn't demand it, and it doesn't provide like economic outcomes. We think that like obviously if you have a really poor population that can make a bunch of money off of ecotourism, they're going to go to ecotourism. We think the fact that they haven't is evidence of the fact that like ecotourism fails, and as I provided you with the statistic, that like 70% of ecotourism incurs massive losses. They talk a little bit about this whole idea of like market price dropping, and we now need to kill like massive amounts of these animals to make any money. What they need to realize is the fact that like ivory is an extremely lucrative business. So if I sell like a horn from $300, and now because I've flooded the market, I drop it down to $50, that is not important. That I still make enough money off of that like $50 that it's like extremely lucrative to me, that I'm still going to like uphold and maintain that. That like Dylan points out the fact that like you can catch parrots for like $325 a day between two people, whereas like a yearly income is $250, right? Like that's huge. We think that like if you drop the price down from like $325 to $50, like $50 a day times 300 is like 15,000, I think, whatever, my math is bad. It is way higher than $250. We think that like that's obviously still like economically viable for you, and that you're still going to value that. We think that that market price drop is like not important enough for you to like go out and destroy all these animals in your like long-term longevity. So we think that like that small decrease isn't important because ivory is so lucrative to begin with. Then finally they talk about this idea of like government corruption can exist. We don't think this is like overly important. We think that like, okay, some government corruption like may exist, there may be some problems, but as like Dylan points out, that there's like no reason to like scrap it and never touch it. We think that like when you actually allow it, and when you allow some like independence of these small communities, that like you may have corruption, but you decrease the corruption that currently exists, where people can like come in with guns and like force you to do things, and that like the black market pressures that currently exist. We think that like when you open up the trade, when you allow your government to have more money, make more money, you can like reinvest that money in security in the first place. So we don't deny the fact that like corruption may not ever exist and there may not be problems, but what we do recognize is that like we decrease that corruption and we decrease that harm when we allow more control, and when we legalize this, and when we allow like the issues to be brought to like the forefront. So what if Dylan and I showed you, in my speech particularly, that like conservation is best upheld and all the harms are mitigated, and for that reason we strongly
Here, I thank the member for his speech and welcome you, the MO, to deliver another constructive speech not to exceed 7 minutes. First and last minute of which are protected. Here.
Alright, so Plishka doesn't understand how individuals make like fundamental decisions, specifically economic decisions with regards to limited resources. So as Catherine pointed out in the POI, there exists this tragedy of the commons where you benefit individually for poaching these animals, but like your society faces the broader harm. But keep in mind that because like you have a relatively small part in this issue, your poaching, like these elephants, are not going to change like the fundamental progress of the development. So if you have a society that is like invested, like each individual is invested in going out and like poaching these elephants, then you as an individual not participating is not going to harm you. However, because you are a starving African villager, you have like a very, very strong incentive like to go out and like get these elephants. So because you're acting like for individual survival, everybody because all of these villagers are mostly poor, everybody is doing this. Like everyone has the incentive to do it as a collective. But the problem is that as an individual, you simply like cannot justify starving yourself to death while depriving yourself of the resources that these elephants will provide. Not right now. So the example that Plishka gave about dairy farms is completely irrelevant, because keep in mind, as a dairy farmer, if I sell off all my cows, it is an individual benefit, but at the same time, I'm the person who is facing my consequences. If you lived in a collective where everybody had all access to the same farm, pardon me, if you lived in a collective where everybody had access to all of the same cows, and everybody got to decide whatever they wanted to do with them, then you would have a very strong incentive, like, to use things unsustainably, because your collective faces the harm, not you, but you face a more dramatic individual harm by not doing so. We think that when you are pushed to the bounds of poverty and desperation, you do not consider the long-term consequences, because the immediate individual consequences are more damaging, and you not participating doesn't change the fundamental outcomes at the end. Yes.
Okay, but because ivory is so lucrative, as soon as I kill one animal, I have food for a month and can sit back and contemplate my long-term goals, because that harm is alleviated immediately.
All right, so that's my next point. So recognize that necessarily individuals with more capital are going to be better able to compete in the system. So we've already recognized that there is this significant problem for black markets, right? So there are already individuals who have the infrastructure, who have the techniques, and who have the individuals who are going out and poaching these animals, and they are very successful at it. They are making lots of money, as Proposition has told us. So who do you think is going to be more able to maximize the profits of opening up this new industry? So is it going to be the villagers who are already dirt poor and impoverished, or is it going to be the poachers who have already established market connections, who already have individuals out there in the field who are practiced at this, who already have the capital to invest in this? We think that these individuals are going to be far more effective and far more damaging, because it is a bonanza. You can go out there and make tons of money because now there is no market restrictions. There isn't a chance that you get caught and sent to jail as a poacher, and as a supply or a member of the supply chain, there isn't a chance that you're going to be prosecuted in an international court. So these individuals are going to go out and make shit tons of money off of this because they can, because they already have the infrastructure, and they don't have any sustainability, or they don't have any concern for sustainability. Where even if you bought that proposition, or that these farmers are actually going to care about these animals, these criminal organizations clearly don't. They already hunt animals to extinction, so clearly sustainable profit isn't a concern for them. They already have lots of money, so they don't need to worry about those individual stresses of not having enough to eat. They are clearly very successful because of all this money that they're making, because it is such a lucrative market. We think that these individuals are not going to be sustainable, but they're going to be better at it than our farmers. And so for these reasons, this is going to eliminate the black market, but it's going to create a gray market that is far more harmful, not only to the ecology, but also to these villagers. So the next thing I'm going to look at is corrupt. Actually, I'll take you right now.
Okay, but we can make hunting licenses that prevent foreigners from hunting these animals easily and enforce that law preventing every single harm you just said.
Okay, so this is a very interesting idea, because recognize that rule of law in underdeveloped African countries is not very strong. Recognize that corruption is rampant, that bribes and payoffs occur all of the time. This is why these markets can exist. So saying that, oh, we'll just give hunting license to locals, that's not going to solve the problem, because these locals are now just going to become puppets for these criminal organizations. And we still haven't solved this problem. So that kind of leads me right into my next point, is corrupt governments and the damage that this is actually doing. So I've explained to you why this model is going to eliminate these markets and create or drive these extinct species, or pardon me, these endangered species to extinction. So even now, at the end of the day, they can say, oh, well, this capital injection is so good, it stimulates local infrastructure and economies. Recognize that this isn't necessarily going to occur, and the long-term social harms are going to be even greater. So first off, we recognize that these governments are corrupt, that they are taking payouts, and that they're not going to be providing sustainable business practices that are going to ensure a fair market. We see this in the diamond trade in the 90s. Just because there are governments doesn't mean that those governments are stable, correct, and are going to act in accordance to international law. They flagrantly violate it all the time. So we don't think that this is going to be a significant enough thing, and there isn't enough enforcement by developed countries to actually do that. We can't do it because of things like sovereignty. All right, so the last thing that I kind of like to talk about is how these businesses and this sort of crony capitalism is going to develop. Even if we have these black markets who have already infiltrated governments to some degree, are given legitimate legal power, this is going to increase their influence because they can now exercise it more effectively. They're able, or pardon me, they have more control over the government because they have a greater investment in it. But that's not the primary issue. The primary issue is that this economic development actually discourages real social change. So if these villagers, if everything is implemented correctly, and in this beautiful, perfect world, these individuals start to get more money, make economic developments, and eventually or contribute to sustainability, recognize that most of these countries are governed by either illegitimate or democratically elected individuals or dictators. And so these individuals have a vested interest in maintaining their power. When you give so therefore they have a vested interest in keeping like these individuals oppressed, because when you give people more power and more agents, like more money, you give them agency and the desire to help themselves, to say like this corruption, like this oppression is not okay, I want to change things. And so like even if we accept that this thing might happen, the individuals who actually have power and who actually have control are going to be actively preventing this, because when these individuals acquire economic resources, when they decide to like sue for change, what this does is like creates a threat on the dictator's power. And so like for this reason, we think that these dictators are actively going to like further the black market, further the gray market, like contribute to criminal organizations, because it maintains their power. Because these people have power and these poor black African villagers don't, this will create an imbalance here.
Here, here. I thank the member for his speech and welcome the leader of the opposition and close up opposition's case with a 3-minute rebuttal. Here, here.
Who allow these elephant populations to be demolished in the first place, right? We're not entirely trusting of whether they're going to implement sustainable practices. Secondly, they're the ones turning a blind eye to poaching now, right? Trevor tells you that corruption occurs in these countries, and that the corruption occurs in these countries. There's not very good governance. We're not entirely sure whether we can implement a sustainable farming regime, even if a harvesting regime, even if we wanted to, right? And internationally, when you legalize the ivory trade internationally, there's no discrimination of whether you buy from good countries or bad countries, right? Do villagers conserve, right? They try to tell you that villagers will implement sustainable practices. We tell you a couple of things. We tell you that the villagers aren't conservationists, right? And they don't without any proper training, and they don't actually know about things like breeding populations, right? And we say that you need to have a critical mass. They haven't dealt with that at all, right? They haven't dealt with the fact, for example, if you kill all the females, there will be no more females, right? There will be no more population, for instance, right? Or if you end up killing off part of the significant portion of the population, you end up losing the capacity to breed in the future, and you don't see those effects until later, right? No engagement on that. We tell you about the tragedy of the commons, right, and about the profit motive, right? And Trevor tells you something really interesting in his speech. He tells you that it's not actually the villagers who are going to be benefiting from these $50 ivory prices, right? It's actually going to be the criminals who already have the infrastructure in place, right? The current regime is that poachers exploit villagers who need money, because poachers are the ones who can get the ivory to market, and so can command high markups, right? And diminishing the market price. So we don't think villagers are going to be the ones profiting from this bonanza, right? The poachers in place will be. So we think that the villagers will still have an incentive to go out and hunt lots and lots of elephants, because they do need that money, right? We don't think that they've given us a sufficient response there, right? But secondly, I want to talk to you about how communities, how conservation happens now, and how do we get sustainable development, right? We've told you that by definition, endangered species are not sustainable populations, right? If you really believed that governments are sensible, that governments would implement conservationist policies now, and they would try to build up their elephant population, and then 100 years later, they would start lobbying for legalizing ivory when these populations aren't in danger, right? If you believe that governments operate on that calculus, this is what they would be doing, right? We told you that you can actually implement reserve systems for elephants. They give you this pithy remark about how it impoverishes communities, right? No, it has high startup costs, and that you have to set aside land, and you have to wait for that population to develop, and then you have to market that to tourists, and you have to wait for those tourists to come, right? That's why lots of villages don't do it now. What we say is that just like with the Brazilian rainforest, if developed countries are the ones responsible for this crisis, then maybe we should start giving the startup capital to help local populations conserve their elephant populations and build up ecotourism, right? We say they didn't give us enough analysis on this point about impoverishing communities. We have, Mr. Speaker. We think in the long run it makes more sense for the welfare of the animals and the welfare of these communities if we implement sustainable development practices.
Here, here. I thank the member for her speech and welcome back the Prime Minister to close up this debate and his case with a 3-minute rebuttal. Here, here.
The vicuna in Peru, the alligator in the United States, the scimitar horned oryx in Africa are all species that we saved by relying on market forces to protect them. But the cockatoo that we listed in 1990, that we banned the trade of, is dead. On our side of the house, we think that we provide the best incentives for both economics and sustainability. We think we've shown that in today's debate. Let's talk a little bit about how we did it. First of all, on the economics frontier, what we got out of opposition was an argument that you would depress prices. Prices that Andrew and I told you were so hilariously high that an individual could make a living off of them by doing a single day's work for an entire community, right? We don't think depressing that price is really much of a disincentive. They also told you that that trade couldn't be sustainable. Andrew gave you a whole argument about why that trade would be sustainable, but we'll return to that in a moment. Then they told you there's a tragedy of the commons. But what did Andrew tell you on that? He said, no, 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 because those elephants are an individual good. If you hunt them to extinction, they will be dead in your lifetime. In 5 years' time, you could wipe out the herd that your particular village relies on. So that's not a collective problem. That is an individual incentive for conservation, and we didn't get a response from them on that. What did we tell you? We said there was huge economic benefits, which they across the board conceded exist at some level for those national governments and for those individuals, and we defend those on proposition. On the issue of trafficking, they told you that poachers would be like hyper-efficient, right? Ignoring any discussion of like a regulatory framework or licensing or any of those intuitive things, we would also point out that I as a farmer want to defend that herd, right? I want to hire security, and I can do that because I have an income, right? I can set up a business to put up fences so that I can protect that animal herd, right? Incentives that do not exist under the status quo. And I think that Andrew already pre-butted a lot of that. They said the government is like ineffective and mean, right? We think the governments of African countries have more legitimacy than machine gun wielding gangs, which is what we get in the status quo if we follow their train of thought, right? So no, we do think that we would prefer the money in the hands of an African government over those traffickers, right? And Andrew gave you a lot of analysis as to why it is that we think it will turn out that way. So, finally, on the issue of ecology, what did they tell you? Maybe ecotourism will work. Despite all of the objective evidence that it doesn't, Mr. Speaker, rainforests are pretty, and a lot of depressing African villages out in the middle of nowhere are not. And this is based on a migrating population. So no, we don't think they actually provided you any alternative way. What else did Andrew tell you? We never got a response from them on the fact that the #1 risk to all of these populations is disappearing habitat, something which is happening in the status quo because there is no economic incentive for conservation when you can't make a dime off of those animals. We think that we provide best for poor African people and for the animals under our model. We are extremely proud to propose.
Hear, hear. I thank all the members for their speeches.